Okay. So you may have said these before out loud in your head to your professor. I've certainly heard this from people. Um, Someone has already talked about my topic and I have nothing new to say. Or I hear, I don't know where my sources are supposed to go in my paper. And the last one is, am I doing it right? All very important questions, actually, because with the literature review, it can seem like you're just saying the same thing over what other people have already done. But they do have a purpose to them. Several purposes, actually. So what literature reviews do are they summarize, evaluate, and compare original research in a specific area, especially as a starting point for new research. So a lot of professors, a lot of researchers conduct a literature review in order to understand what needs to be done next or what hasn't been done, because it places current research in the context of past research, sort of like going on in a timeline. So where are you in that path? It highlights the focal point of the student's research, demonstrates the ability to critically evaluate relevant sources and incorporate them into your work, and identify inconsistencies, gaps, and contradictions in the literature in preparation for new research. Now, I'm talking about this just as if it's only for research papers, but some papers are just literature reviews themselves. And basically what they do is they show your knowledge of your discipline, of your field. And for professors, that can be very important because it shows what you've learned so far. So, how do you start with a literature review? Well, it's always good to define what exactly your subject is. So it's usually something in your discipline. Create some research questions with it and decide what the scope of it is. So is it a general broad theme, or are you studying something very specific within your field? Of course, you find sources that are suitable and relevant. Analyze and interpret the sources you selected in terms of how they relate to your research. And take notice of any patterns or subtopics you find. We'll discuss that later. And then you'll select an organizational strategy that suits your findings or predetermined writing needs. Okay, so it's not enough to just collect sources. You also need to evaluate them. Why is it important? Well, not all sources are created equal, because the quality of your sources directly impacts the quality of your literature review. You could be an excellent writer, always received A's in your papers in the past, but if you have bad sources, that translates to a bad paper. So good writing skills isn't going to save your paper if you're using the wrong sources. So what exactly do you evaluate? Well, typically, you should look at what type of source it is, who the authors of the source are, the location of the source, and how old it is. So first, let's talk about primary and secondary sources. Distinct differences between them. A primary source provides direct or firsthand evidence about an event, phenomenon, object, person, or work of art. An example of this could be journal entries by soldiers during World War II. So think of it as like an artifact that you find at an archaeological dig. It's actually the piece of history itself. So a diary, that's a piece of history. It was actually recorded by a person experiencing what they're seeing. Or a reporter scribbling notes when they're witnessing an event. That's history as it's happening. Secondary sources are once removed from the primary source. So a secondary source describes, discusses, interprets, comments on, analyzes, evaluates, summarizes, and processes primary sources. A good example is a history book interpreting the emotions of soldiers in wartime based on the journal entries described above. So the journal itself is the primary source. The history book that describes the journal would be a secondary source. So a few more examples of that would be of primary sources: news and magazine articles that report firsthand or eyewitness accounts of an event, diaries, journals, and letters, government records, and published results of research studies, experiments, or clinical trials. So the written accounts as close to the event as possible. Whereas other examples of secondary sources are biographies, histories, book, art, and theater reviews, interpretations of literature, and even other academic literature reviews. So you might be thinking that, oh, then I should only use primary sources in my literature review. That's not necessarily the case, because secondary sources are often compiled by experts in the field who have spent years compiling and analyzing the primary sources. So sometimes you need that expert advice in your own paper in order to really understand a field. So my recommendation is that usually you want to combine primary and secondary sources together in your paper. Next, we look at the author. In my classes, I talk a lot about ethos. Ethos is, why should we trust the person who wrote this thing? And so when we look at ethos, we look at the author. We look at their education. Where did they study? What is their field? Is their field relevant to what they're writing? What kind of publications do they have, either in academia, such as academic articles, or in journalism? Are they well known with it? What positions have they held? Are they the head of their department? How long has their experience been in the field? Is the author one person, many people, or an organization itself? Because sometimes an article is not really written by one person, but written by a group. And of course, that's fine if the group is valid. Or do we even know who the author is? So you want to ask yourself, if we don't know who the author is, can we truly trust this as worthy? That goes into who the publisher of the source is. What are their criteria for publication? What type of things do they typically publish? And what kind of reputation do they have? Here we have two organizations. On the right is NPR. So NPR stands for National Public Radio. It's a long established media organization, generally considered to be very trustworthy. But then on the left, we have Weekly World News. And it says Hillary Clinton adopts alien baby. It's a little, we don't know if we can truly trust this organization because maybe they publish sensational news items. And next, we also look at the age of the source. So how old is the source? And you might be thinking, well, I should only use the most recent sources. Not necessarily the case. So you should analyze your topic to determine if a source from 20 years ago will be as accurate as one from 2 months ago. So think of a topic that would benefit from recent publications, and think about a topic that would benefit from older sources. So if you're studying something from World War II, it might be beneficial to find primary sources that were made around the time of World War II. But if you're examining vaccines with the coronavirus, you might want to see the most recent publications in that field. Next, we have to think about, where do we find these sources? And the number one that I tell my students is you should look at peer-reviewed journals first. So what is a peer-reviewed journal? And what are articles in a peer-reviewed journal? They're academic publications in which the articles have been reviewed and verified by other scholars, such as professors. So I'll give you an example because I submitted an article for peer review. I wrote an article, I sent it to this journal. A group of professors that I don't know who they are read my work and then either rejected it because the quality was too low, or they gave me advice on how I should revise it and then resubmit it again. And so this way, experts in my field study my article and they tell me to redo it again and again until it's suitable for publication. Generally, peer-reviewed journal articles are the most trustworthy sources you can find because they've been verified by experts in your field. Next, though, are dissertations, and you can often find them in a database that aggregates published dissertations, such as ProQuest. So a dissertation is an academic study a scholar performs to obtain a doctoral degree. I'm working on a dissertation currently. I know the people who are reviewing my dissertation, but I still need to get their approval before it can be completed. And so we can also consider this as a very trustworthy source. They're often very long, but often they have an abstract where you can read it to get an idea of what the dissertation is about. Other places you can search online. You can go to a .gov website, which is a government website. Here you often find government statistics if you're looking for them. You can go to an EDU site, an educational website, such as the Purdue L. This is often where you can find different studies that universities publish. Or you can go to a .org or .com website. There used to be a distinct difference between them, but pretty much anybody can make a .org or .com website. Be very careful with these last two. You can find valid information on them, but sometimes the information they publish is not truly verified. So beware. Okay. You're collecting your sources. You want to think about how you're going to organize the literature. There are many different ways you can do this. You can do it chronologically, which, as you see from the clocks, means by time. So from earliest to latest. You can organize it thematically, which means by order of the sub-themes. And I'll explain that in a little bit. You can even organize it methodologically. So by the different methods that a person used. And if I escape out of this for a moment and go down, there, if you can see, there's some different ways you can organize it as well. So some organize it by debate. So you find two sides of an argument and you group studies on one side versus another side. Or you do it by seminal study here at the bottom. A seminal study is a very important study in the field, typically that a lot of articles respond to. So there was a famous or infamous study that vaccines cause autism. You can base a literature review on all the studies that have responded to that article. And if I scroll down a little bit, you can see the different organization strategies. So here we have three important aspects of this field have received extended critical attention. Length of time students spend on writing literature reviews, the amount of revision typically required by thesis advisors, and the extent to which highlighters help or hinder the review process. This would be organizing it thematically because you identify different themes around an idea. And each paragraph talks about one of these different themes. But then you can, of course, do it chronologically. So in number 2, the study was first studied by Smith in 1910, who found that graduate students, blah, 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 in 1955, in the 1960s. So here you see it's organized chronologically, which means from the earliest study up through the years to the latest one. Okay, let me try to go back to, there we go, to my PowerPoint. Now, You might be working with 5 sources. You might be working with 25 sources. In my case, I'm working with well over 100 sources in my dissertation. That's a lot of sources. How are you possibly going to juggle all of them in your research paper? Sometimes students give me papers of their annotated bibliography, and it looks like this. Author 1 talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is right because he answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author 2 talks about this, this, and this. She then talks about this. I think she is right because she answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author 3 talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is kind of right because he kind of answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. This is not really a literature review. This is an annotated bibliography, which is basically a description of each source, but they're not connected together. You need to think about how you're going to connect your sources together. You need to think about how you're going to synthesize sources together. So here we see a Lego cat. A bunch of us in our department have a lot of cats. So I myself have 2 now, and they're very adorable. They may pop in on the screen if they jump on the computer. But you see, this cat is made up of different parts, but the parts connect together in a way that makes sense. So when you're synthesizing your sources, rather than forcing sources into the paper to fit the requirements, like your page count, whatever, students such as you should be synthesizing sources together so that the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. In other words, you're combining sources together to send a message that's greater than all of them at once. How do we do that? So we make something, well, this is a tool that you can use. It's called a source matrix. It's not as cool as the movie The Matrix, but it can be very helpful. What you do is you can, in a program like Microsoft Excel, or you can hand draw this on a piece of paper, you make a grid, and on this grid, you put your different sources. So while you're reading your sources, you should be making notes about them and trying to find different summaries of ideas with it. When you take those summaries and you put them in here, you can start to see which ones match across each other. So from that, you create a common theme. So this common theme could be critical thinking and writing, because Swider found that writing contributes to critical thinking, writing stimulates critical thought, and Smith found that critical thinking and writing are linked in the study. Now, there are differences with it. So for example, Swider thought writing was the most important contributor to critical thinking. Jones thought reading was more important, and Smith claims different types of writing stimulate different levels of critical thinking. But we see a connection, and that connection is that there's a link between critical thinking and writing. This will be important when you go and write your literature review later. So in the second workshop, we will come back to this. Your matrix can get very large, actually, if you have a lot of sources. So let's say you have a topic. You want to study anxiety in graduate students. So you find different sources that talk about this in some way, and you come up with some major themes. So one might be multiple roles of graduate students, relationships with graduate students, and classroom environment with anxiety in graduate students. You will see that not every source fits in all of these categories. In fact, maybe only one theme can be found in a source. That's okay, because you shouldn't force the source to fit into your requirements. You're just describing what is there, And then you're making a list of what findings you see that can fit in one theme, what findings you see that can fit into another theme. And you are creating the theme yourself, right? So you're making a descriptive phrase that describes whatever ideas that you're finding within these readings. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's nice, but this is very confusing. So how do I know what the theme is? Well, that's up to you. You're going to have to code for the theme. One strategy you can use to find common themes and topics among sources is to develop a code for them, for passages that revolve around a theme. And you can later use these codes to develop different sections of your paper. Very easy way to do this is to highlight a section of text that you read, give it a color, and then label the color with a short phrase that summarizes what the section discusses. Let me show you. Okay, so I copy and pasted this from the Wikipedia article about English as a global language. Let's say that I have a research question. What is the role of English in the world? This paragraph I'm reading, it's talking about decolonization and English language. So I think, okay, I'm going to color this red and I'm going to give this code English and colonialism. This paragraph talks about global communication in English. So I'm going to color this green and I'm going to give it the phrase English and global communication. And then over here, this one talks about English and how it's used with other languages. I'm going to color that blue and give it the phrase English and other languages. So what you do with these codes then is that when you're reading other sources, you find a passage that fits maybe with English and colonialism, you give that the color red. And so now you have an easy way to visualize all of these different themes that are starting to appear across all of your sources. It's very cool. Well, I think it's cool. You might not think it's cool, but it makes the literature review a lot simpler, right? When you see all of these connections across your sources. Finally, we have this idea that research is a recursive process. So it's not just when you get ready to write, you stop researching, because as you're writing, you might find that you need more information on a topic. So you need to go back and research more and collect more sources. Your themes might be very vague early on. That's normal. As you read more and you read sources that are connected with the themes you're developing, you enhance your themes and you split them up even more by subtopic and subtopic. So it's very normal to be researching right up until you hand that paper in. So research is recursive. It's like a cycle. It goes over and over again. Okay, so that's sort of the main part with it. Part two, which is writing the literature review, that will be next week at 5 p.m. There, we'll start talking about actually writing it, using the CARS method for the introduction in literature review, choosing the right strategy for in-text citations, using transitions effectively, and strategies for paraphrasing in your lit review. So that's sort of the main part with it. I do want to show you a very useful tool while you're thinking of questions. Some of you may have heard of Google Scholar before. I love Google Scholar. It's a very useful tool when you're looking for research, because what it does is it aggregates academic articles across all databases and puts it up there. So let's say that I'm looking for things that talk about coffee. It will give you a list of different sources. So right down here, 4 stars, this book, it shows you that this is a book. It's been cited by 362. What that means is that 362 other sources have used this source within their work. Generally, the higher the number, the more the source has been used in the field. We generally consider that to be a major source. So if something's been cited thousands of times, like down here, we can consider that a useful source. You'll see here too, there's a star. If you hit that, it will save it to your library. So if you start an account, you can have a library. And you'll see that it saved it right there, so I can return to it later. So when you're doing research, you see something that interests you, you can hit the star, and then it gets saved right in there. Let me show you to the advanced search. So let's say that you want to search for specific things that you want to omit other things with it. So let's say that I have a research question. What are the effects of caffeine on the brain? From that research question, I came up with some keywords: caffeine, tea, coffee, brain. So if I go back into Google Scholar, find articles with all of the words caffeine, tea, and brain. I hit any, and where my words occur, anywhere in the article. I hit search. We see favorable effects of tea on reducing cognitive deficits and brain morphological changes in sentient accelerated mice. Okay, so that might be useful because it talks about caffeine and tea on the brain. If we go back, we click caffeine, brain. I have a feeling that coffee will appear in a lot of these, but let's say I want to search for articles that don't talk about coffee. So find articles with all the words caffeine and brain without the words coffee. I click search. Again, it takes me to there. You can also see, if you go to the main page, you can click articles that have been created since 2020, since 2016, or from any time, depending on how recent you want your search to be. So Google Scholar, I love it. I use it all the time in my research. Also, very quickly too, Wikipedia itself is an excellent way to understand how literature reviews work. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say I'm looking up coffee. As you're reading through it, you can see how it organizes it by topic. You can see also how it aggregates different sources together. And I will discuss this more in the second workshop. But if you wanted an example of how to combine tons of sources within your literature review, just study Wikipedia, because even here you can see how it connects different sources together. And then of course at the bottom, you can see what type of sources they're using as well. Okay, very quickly, go back into my PowerPoint.
Wait, Jim, just before you, Jim, hi. Just
Yes.
before you go out of Google Scholar, somebody's asking if there's a way to limit Google Scholar to peer-reviewed articles.
That is a good question. What you should do is check what type of source. So usually peer-reviewed articles appear in journals, right? So as you're searching it, you'll see here where it says journal of blah, 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 journal, or ProQuest, as Elsevier. These are the major databases for journal articles. Google Scholar is not perfect. All it's doing is it's sort of throwing different sources right at you. It's up to you to then go and evaluate whether that's a journal article or not.
Mhm.
Actually, yeah, you can see here it says articles. So if you click on that, it will try to give you journal articles. But again, you need to actually go in and evaluate to whether it is a true journal article or not. So that sort of concludes my formal part of this. Let me stop sharing so that I can see everybody and put my video on again.